Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA. Another episode of Monday Memoirs. Today, we'll be discussing the journey of Michelle Gregory. Thank you, Michelle, for joining us today. It is always a pleasure seeing new faces and meeting people for the first time that I've never met before, and so it's a pleasure having you on. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Very good, very good, very good. All right. Well, I'll tell you what. It's thank you for your flexibility as well. We had another one set up, but we couldn't reach him at the last minute. So thanks to Deanna Mariletti for taking care of the booking on this whole thing, and she was able to connect you and I. Great job, Deanna.
Yep.
And so here we are. We're just going to kind of take this thing. First, I'm going to put your name up there in the email, so that way if anybody wants to reach you, they certainly can. So you guys write this down, or you can go back and watch the video later and pause it to write her email address down, adarra2004@gmail.com. Ms. Michelle Gregory, once again, thank you. And so, so we'll go ahead and kick this thing off with rocking on with our questions as soon as I stop clicking buttons that are...
No button clicking.
Yeah, that was not the buttons I was hoping to click. So anyway, so we'll go with this now. So, okay, so typically, now I'm looking for the questions and I just lost them. Hang on one second. I forgot I sent them to two people, and the one that actually failed was that. Here we go. All right, so the very first question I always go with, and this is the protocol. I've been asked to keep this thing under a nice scheduled thing. We'll probably carry this thing out for maybe 30 minutes or so. If we need to go longer, we can. We've got about 10 questions, and first one we'll kick off right now is we want to know a little bit about your history. Want to know where did you have family? Were you raised by a Christian family, or do you have parents or grandparents or people of that range that actually were preachers themselves? Tell us a little bit about that.
So, actually, I was raised in a very devout Roman Catholic family. My father, in his early 20s, actually, after he'd come back from World War II, went into the monastery and decided that, he had this calling and was going to be a brother. And this was up in Washington at St. Martin's, and was there for a while and then ended up leaving, obviously, or I would not be here. But he, right. But I have pictures of him, and he would talk about his time there, and he was in his full monk garb and belt and ginormous beads and you name it, Brother Peter. And so he would talk about that a lot. And then being raised Catholic, we went through Sunday school and catechism. I went through Catholic middle, high, and high school. I was a Eucharistic minister in high school. And I was involved in, youth groups. And actually, I started kind of trending away from the Catholic Church and got really involved in campus life. If anyone's involved in campus life or has a background, it's more of an ecumenical, evangelical youth group. And so that's kind of how I spent all my early years.
Okay.
What I didn't know until I was an older child is that my mom actually was Jewish.
Wow, cool.
But she never talked about her past. And my uncle, who I absolutely adored, would explain to me that he was what was called a fulfilled Jew, which I guess is Messianic Jew. And he actually was a minister who would travel to churches and explain how Jesus fulfilled Passover. And so I thought that's what I was, because that's how I was raised. And I was really confused for a while because I didn't understand, well, if I'm Jewish, then why do I go to Catholic Church? So yeah, there was a lot of confusion for a while around that.
Right. Wow. No kidding. So I definitely can resonate with that because of my my role in the Messianic movement as well, which it's definitely definitely a tricky place to be at and to come from, for sure. So, okay, let me see. I got to do one thing. I just lost my screen again. There we go. Okay, so question number 2 is going to be when did you first have in your opinion, a God calling experience? Like you were I don't know, like for me, for example, the first time I ever had a God experience, I think I was probably like 8 or 9 years old. Now, it's kind of ridiculous to say that because I was too young, but I still remember it though. And then for me, it was probably years later. It was probably like 21 when I finally said, you know what, I think I'm going to serve God. And I had reasons. So how was it for you? How was that whole approach for you?
I think I always was a really spiritual person in that I really wanted this connection to God. And so I, as a child, I didn't know so much because in the Catholic Church and going to Sunday school, it was pretty boring actually. Because you sit in mass and there's not really a lot of involvement for the kids. It was more when we actually went to classes. But I would say it wasn't until I was older, when I had left the Catholic Church and I was married at the time. I got married when I was 21, and we started going to an Assemblies of God church where a lot of like ex-Catholics went, and so they would actually do communion every Sunday, which is not normal, but because there are so many ex-Catholics and they're like, well,
Wow.
we need to have communion. So they would have a little room where you could go do communion every Sunday. And then I decided that I just felt this really strong calling and it really hit me. And so I was probably about 22 and I decided to be baptized and went through the full immersion baptism. So that's probably when I felt that really strong, I need to do this, and went through that process.
Nice. Okay, very cool. So moving further, what do you when did you think that you actually felt the calling? Like you were like the preaching is actually what I need to do, or
Well,
teaching of some kind. When did that actually take place?
when I was married and we went to a lot of different churches, and we ended up going to a Foursquare church for a while, and we would go on Wednesday nights. So it was like we had church on Sunday and then Bible study on Wednesdays, and they were very was speaking in tongues and doing the healing, the hand laying on of hands, and I got really caught up in that. And so we found another church to start going to, and they had Royal Rangers, which is a Christian scouting organization, and I really wanted to get involved with the kids, and they didn't need any Sunday school help because they already had a full cadre of teachers. However, they needed a leader for the young boys, so I became the Royal Ranger commander for the was 6 and 7 year olds, and so I was working with the young boys and doing all kind of scout experiences.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So, what do you think your first? This is definitely moving forward. At what point or what age, what crossroads did you hit when you first started questioning the validity of the New Testament? What was your first red flag, and where did it proceed from
It
there?
actually, going back into high school, it started when I was in school, and I would ask questions, and the nuns wouldn't be able to answer the questions, which is one of the reasons I ended up branching off from going to Catholic church to an evangelical church. But then, as I started to get more and more involved in church and teaching, um, I kept having these questions of, well, if Jesus did all these things, or for like the healing, the big thing, how come you're not going to the hospital and doing this? Why is it only these certain people at church that come? How come if you have this healing gift, you aren't out in the community? And nobody could really explain that to me. Because it's like, if you have this, you should be going to like the children's hospitals or something. So that was one. And then plus just reading the different gospels and having things saying it says this in, say, Matthew, but it says this in John. And probably a lot like everyone else, I didn't really know the AKA Old Testament,
Right.
the Hebrew Bible, because everything was the New Testament. And I only had the New Testament. I didn't even have a full Bible that had the Old Testament in it. It was just all the Gospels, Paul. And as we started studying the letters of Paul, then I was really starting to question things because things weren't making sense to me. And I think what really bucked it for me is when it was like women should be seen and not heard.
Oh, wow.
And and it was like, well, you can't work with the
You can
older
tell he was
kids. You can
never
work with the young.
right. And that right there should tell you right there. Paul was never married.
Obviously.
Now we know why.
I was
That's
like,
funny.
it wasn't like one big thing, William. It was like a little thing after little thing after little thing after little thing. And I really just started to back off and stop going. I stopped being a Royal Ranger commander because I felt like I could not do that any longer. And then my marriage was starting to separate. Things weren't cohesive, to the point where after 12 years we ended up divorcing. And it's because he still was really strong on that path and I was going way off the other direction.
Falling from grace.
Pretty much.
Gotcha. Okay.
From speaking in tongues to I'm not doing this anymore.
Right. So you have actually spoken in tongues before.
Yes.
That's cool.
Yes.
I have too. I haven't met a lot of people who have. Some of them have, some of them haven't. But it's neat talking to people who actually have experienced that before. What is your take on that now?
Oh, it was like, I think there's a lot of getting caught up in the emotion of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, no, you can do this. Because his brother, who we were close to, was like, I know Michelle's ready. She's going to start. And it was kind of like being coached into it. And then it was like, yeah, you're doing it. And even though
right,
you weren't, I mean, you're just talking gibberish. I mean, there's nothing that makes any sense.
Right. But at the time, you believed you were doing
emotion,
it, though, right?
You know?
At the time it was happening, you really believed it was happening.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember coming home one night and I was in front of the apartment door and it was like I just had this feeling and I'm like, what? You know?
Right.
Yeah. It was, yeah. But at the time, yeah, you're bought in. Mm-hmm. You're really doing it.
Right. Very good. So from the first time that you noticed the first problems when you were when you were in high school, let's push that a little further back, because I guess my date that I'm looking for is the first time you went like, oh, this definitely is not right. I mean, something is not right with the New Testament versus the Old Testament. How old were you when that particular aha moment happened, and then how much time did you spend studying before you finally left the church altogether, Christianity altogether, New Testament?
I would say when I was in high school, when I left the Catholic Church, when it started coming in, where it was the whole everything centered around the communion and believing in that at that point with the priest, that the Eucharist became the body of Christ and the wine became the blood of Christ, and that everything was centered around the Mass. It was all centered around this and going up and participating in the Eucharist. So that really started to bother me. And then I had my favorite nun, who was my art teacher. And I'm surprised she actually stayed a nun, because she was pretty out there. And Sister Catherine Nolan, she was just amazing. And she would teach things like looking in a mirror. You're looking at God. If you're looking in a mirror, and it was like really teaching about yourself and what you're putting out to the world, and kind of going off the true Catholic. So it was kind of like, yeah, I kind of feel like that. So that was kind of like the initial kind of like, are you sure this is right? So then that kind of put those seeds in there, and over time it grew, but it took a long time to get there. I mean, it was not it was not a short process. It took years, because that was all the way through my late 20s, I guess. And then when we finally divorced, I mean, I was like 31 where I finally got to the point of I'm done. So it was a very gradual.
Right, gotcha. I know for
Yeah.
me it was like roughly a 3 year from start to finish. For me, it was like it took about 3 years. So yeah, and it was for me it was gradual as well. So so you say you were 31 whenever you finally shut the door on the New Testament, roughly.
Yep. Yep. It was like, you know what? This really, it was like I shut everything off. And then I had a really good friend, and I would tell her, I said, I'm a Christian. At least I think I'm a Christian, but I don't think Christians would think I'm a Christian.
Right.
Because I didn't know at that point it was like really trying to search for other things. And I just really felt like everything was so patriarchal, and women weren't held in very good esteem. And of course, because I didn't know anything about Judaism or about the Hebrew Bible, everything was through the New Testament filter, that I didn't even think of going back to look. It was kind of like, I'll just toss the whole thing out.
Right.
At that point. So I did. And so then I wandered for a long time.
So you basically
find a place.
became technically not necessarily atheist, but agnostic, to say the best, for a short period of time.
Yeah, I would say I did believe there was a God, but I couldn't pin anything down. I couldn't figure out like a personal relationship, because obvious it wasn't Jesus.
Right.
And so I felt angry, probably like a lot of Christians do, coming out of the church, that you had the wool pulled over your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
But there had to be something. So I joined a pagan church at the time called Portland Gathering, and I went to friends that were involved in Wicca.
Mm-hmm.
And so I did that for a little bit, but that didn't feel right either, because it was like, yeah, this isn't right either. But I'm still like trying to find. And I ended up going to the Unitarian Universalist Church for several years. But again, it was like, there was, I don't know, there was like this lack. There wasn't any connection.
What was the thing at the Unitarian Church that you actually enjoyed? What part made you feel like this could be it?
I really enjoyed the fact that they have 7 principles, that it's not dogmatic, and really it is the social justice and taking care of each other.
Nice.
That's really what did it for me, was the community, the sense of community, and really reaching out and helping other people.
Very cool.
Because that always had been what I was striving to do and trying to do, and teaching Sunday school and working with the youth and teaching preschool for 7.5 years. It was always wanting to do something. And so that's where the Unitarian Universalist, plus they take something from everything. So it's not Christian. It's very liberal. So there was a lot of people from all different backgrounds that came, and they would have speakers from different viewpoints that would speak too. So you could kind of learn a little bit from everything.
Gotcha. So it was like a mixing pot of people who believed in different things, I guess.
Yeah. Because you could have a Sikh come in, you could have a Buddhist monk come in. You just never knew.
Right. That's cool. Good to know. So once you were really closing in on leaving, who did you talk to about? Did you talk to your priest? Did you have family members that you expressed your concerns about the scriptures with before you left the church altogether and left the New Testament altogether? Or did you do this on your own?
I pretty much did it on my own. I mean, I had talked with one of the ministers, but it was like you just need to pray about it. You just need to pray more.
Right.
I'm like, that's not getting me anywhere.
Which means they can't answer your questions for you.
It's not solving the questions that I have, or the answers. And you're telling me that Mary was a virgin, and how can that be? And yet the Bible says Jesus had brothers.
Mm. That's
So
funny.
obviously there's something here.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, how did you approach the telling? How did you pretty much did this on your own? But the one person you had to tell was your husband. How did you approach that? How did apparently you told us how it went, and I'm sorry to hear that he didn't come along.
Yeah.
However, you want to walk us through that and see if there's anything we can glean from it?
Yeah. Well, we got married really young, and at the time I was thinking we were on the same path because I was whole gung into everything, and his brother, who he was really close to and who I became really close to, was going to the church and invited us. So that's kind of how that all started. And so I would have questions, and I would ask Larry, his brother, and then when things started going rough, we did go to some marital counseling, but I think at that point, it was obvious that I was going away from the path that he was on. And he wasn't interested in going that path. He was still really into the church. And in fact, after we got divorced, it wasn't too long after that he married a lady in the church, and they're happily married, and they still go. And that's, that worked out for him, and that's where he's at.
Right.
Where I went through this whole wandering period of trying to figure out where I fit in, and is there a God? I think there's a God. Where is God?
Right. Okay. So what would you tell? What would you tell now, or maybe you already had this conversation? But what would you tell to someone who saw your video and right now is listening to your story? And what would you say to them if they told you, well, you know what, you just never really knew Jesus to start with, otherwise you would have never left? How would you handle that?
I would tell him that at the time, I absolutely 100% knew that I knew Jesus, because I lived, breathed, name it, concerts, events, there, from going through the full immersion baptism and speaking in tongues. No, there was no question in my mind that I knew Jesus, and that Jesus was in my life, and Jesus was in my heart. And I had memorized John 3:16 when I was
Yep.
12 years old. And, it was, no, it was, I would disagree with them and say that's actually not the case. What is the case is I came to know that that really wasn't the truth over time, and that there was a lot of stubbornness on my part to
Right.
finally let that go and realize that it isn't what it's told you that it is.
Right. Right. This next question is kind of blended with something I didn't ask you earlier. So, what is your favorite, like now, when somebody questions you and questions your departure, what is one of your first go-to Tanakh references from the Hebrew Scriptures, Old Testament, if you will, that you would lead them into saying, hey, you need to read this before you judge me on leaving the New Testament, something like that?
I really like Tehillim. I really like the Psalms. And I think that the whole piece where you have the mistranslation of saying pierced,
Oh, good one.
because that's a big one that that people take to heart, because when you first read it on the surface, boy, it sure sounds like it's talking about Jesus. They pierced my hands and my side, until you realize that's not what it says. And then you can start realizing that if you are open-minded and you really do want to know, I mean, if you're truly looking, and you can set aside the viewpoint of looking for Jesus in every page, and be willing to read the scripture on its own, looking at the audience it was written for, then you can start discovering that things aren't what you had been told. So that's probably a favorite. And then also Isaiah 53, because that is another one where it's really easy to point out it's not what you think it is.
Right.
They're very clear texts.
Yeah, so Psalm 22:16 I think is the
Yep.
one. But yeah, you're
Yep.
right. It's a blatant mistranslations for sure, and the Isaiah for sure. Those are good stuff right there, no doubt. So, what kind of advice do you have for someone who might be noticing issues now themselves, and maybe they're watching your video right now and they're saying, I've noticed some weird things too. What would you tell them to do next in their journey?
What was really helpful to me, and I actually wrote Rabbi Singer a letter after discovering Tanakh Talk, was A, Tanakh Talk, and B, Rabbi Singer's 2 books, Let's Get Biblical, Q&A, because that gave me such a breakdown of being able to take the verses side by side and really understand what was being said versus this is what the New Testament says and it's not. And that was huge, because all those fallback pieces, it's like that's really not what it was written. And then Rabbi Federer's book was really interesting as well. So I think that those are the best places to start, because if you are really wanting to look, and if you're a visual learner, the books are the best way to go, because then you can go back to it time after time after time. You can highlight things and put tabbies in and go, wait, what about this? And you can go back and look.
Very good advice. And for you viewers out there who are interested in those books that she mentioned, there is a short 2.5-minute video ad at the end of this section today. And with links at the bottom of the video, you'll find links to all the books that are actually in this video ad. So, well, listen, Michelle, thank you again for being so flexible in your schedule and for your wonderful testimony. And I can't wait to see the responses of the people after they see this. And hopefully it'll be something you can share with your friends, maybe your family.
I know. It's really hard because my sister's Messianic, and she's the one who actually helped me come back to Judaism, because she said, well, Mom was Jewish. That means you're Jewish. And at that point, William, this was like 5 years ago.
That's interesting. Wow.
6 years ago. And it was like, I'm Jewish. What does that mean?
Yep.
What does it mean that I'm Jewish? So then I started down the whole path, and that's when I found my great-grandfather was a Cohen, and my family had immigrated here from Russia. And that I remember the one thing my mom told me, that we were Russian Jews who escaped discrimination and pogroms, and that's why they came here. And I did DNA testing and found cousins I had no idea even existed, and started going to Chabad and embraced the fact that no, I'm Jewish. And now Baruch Hashem, I know God.
Amen.
Or at least I'm learning to know God.
Wow. What some great words of closing for sure. Michelle, thank you so much, and I really appreciate once again you taking the time to join us today and tell everybody your story. It's quite an amazing story. Thank you so much. I need to get you and my wife to talk together. She was raised Catholic.
Yes, I would love to.
That's cool. All right, we'll see you guys later. Thank you guys once again. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Turn on notifications. If you don't turn on the notifications, you won't have any idea when we go live. And that's about it. See you guys later. Peace.
איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. אני אתה אתם תמיד כולם ביחד, חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד. איפוק זו העוצמה, ויתור זו הגדולה, השאיפה והכמיהה. חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, זה טבעם של אנשים שונים. נזכור בסוף כולנו שותפים, חשוב תמיד להיות אנושיים. חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים, זה טבעם של אנשים שונים. נזכור בסוף
Have you been questioning what is actually written in your New Testament? Are you tired of getting the same old responses when you ask your pastor or preacher questions about things that just don't add up? If you're like me, the most popular answers I always get are, sometimes you just have to have faith, or some things just can't be explained. Well, I'm here to tell you that everything can be explained. Here are 4 good resources that will help you get a better understanding of what the Hebrew Scriptures, also known as the Old Testament, actually teaches, and why it is that the New Testament just does not seem to match.
Revealing Matthew's Secrets by Jason Lacrosse. Leaving Jesus by James Wood Jr. Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast by Rabbi Stuart Federow. Let's Get Biblical 2-volume book set by Rabbi Tovia Singer.
If you or anyone you know would benefit from these resources, please share this video link with your friends and family and help spread the one true light.
This advertisement has been sponsored by an anonymous donor. All these resources can be found in links below the video.
Te